and how it works, why you should care, and then how does it apply to my business is our next area. So let me tell you one secret about Harvard Business School and the professors that teach at HBS. We always have to create a 2x2, right? That's part of our contract with the dean. The school insists that we should have a 2x2 for everything we do. So Marco, Ian Seed, and I generated a 2x2 to help you think about, how does it apply to my business? So when we were thinking about blockchain and trying to put it in sort of historical context around the scope of technologies, around the evolution of technologies, what we realized is that there is a precursor technology that helps us create an analogy. And this analogy comes from TCP/IP. So TCP/IP is the foundation for the internet. And this technology was invented in the 70s through R&D work sponsored by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, to think through sort of a decentralized communications network. And TCP/IP, in the 70s, was viewed very skeptically by those that looked at this technology and said, we can't imagine decentralized networks working. And so there was a long incubation period before companies and individuals learned about the technology and figured out how to take TCP/IP and create a whole new set of applications that we now take for granted. So I gave the example of email, but almost anything you do on your smartphones, when you use FaceTime, when you use Skype, when you go on the web, all of that relies on TCP/IP. And our view is that blockchain also is a foundational technology where we're not going to imagine you as a business person creating a blockchain, something of blockchain. You will be creating applications on top of blockchain. And that's the way to start to think about it, right? As a business person, you don't care about TCP/IP. What you care about is what you can do with TCP/IP in the sense of, can I do messaging? Can I do chats? Can I do video? Can I do database communications? So blockchain is a foundational technology to think through. And when we start thinking about foundational technologies, there are two dimensions that you want to start to think through. The first is novelty of application, right? How new is the application being created, right? Is it a first in the world kind of an application, or is it already existed before? And the second dimension to think about is complexity of coordination, right? How many other people do you need to also be using this technology in order for it to have any value whatsoever? So think about this in terms of like a fax machine, right? A fax machine is useless if it just sits with you, right? There's no use of a fax machine by itself. As you increase the number of other users that have fax machines, then the value of having a fax machine increases. If there's 2 people in the world with fax machines, then you can go back and forth. If 3, more people can communicate. If there's 10, there's many more ways to communicate. And so these two dimensions help us think through the types of applications that we imagine taking place, right? So here's my 2x2, right? And the 2x2 basically looks at novelty of application, and coordination complexity. And then we can think of this as low or high, right? And low or high. Okay? And then this allows us to think through where the technology is, what the applications are, and how difficult it will be for us to get adoption of these technologies. So in this way, we can think about Bitcoin, right, as a single-use application, right, where basically what we're doing is we're saying, I need currency, I need digital currency. I don't need that many people for me to have value in the transactions taking place. And I'm basically taking a concept of currency and then applying it all over again. So this becomes a single-use application, and this is what we see happen quite a bit, where people are solving one particularly small problem. I mean, currency is a big part of the world, but still it's a very well-defined problem that we want to solve, and that's where blockchain comes in and enables Bitcoin to come through. Then what we imagine happening is movements this way, and diagonally across, right? So when we cut across, what we see are localizations, right? Where basically what's happening is that we're trying to get some new interesting applications to take place that allow us to do things in a more efficient, effective way. And here we see a lot of the emergence of what we call private chains, where companies are getting together and saying, I just need 10 partners to coordinate. I just need 10 partners to work together. We will move our entire ledger technology, right, to each other, right? But because we trade so many times amongst ourselves, there's no need for us to have an intermediary to keep records of these things. We can just share a distributed database ourselves. So private chains are a way to solve the problem of coordination. We basically work together to coordinate and use blockchain as an underlying technology. So a lot of interest is happening here in the financial services space around private chains. Then we have what we call substitution, where basically we're going to try to come up with a real substitute for existing things that are at scale. So here we are seeing marketplaces, etc., emerge where instead of Amazon as being the bottleneck where we have to transact through, we can imagine, again, a peer-to-peer network of merchants and consumers where we are all connected on a peer-to-peer basis with each other, and we can all start to transact with each other. So instead of a centralized hub like Amazon and then people and merchants on different sides, right, we're imagining this as a substitution. And this is also now being explored and being investigated. But you can imagine that there's a lot of work here to make this kind of a distributed marketplace take hold over the advantages of a centralized marketplace. Things like search and discovery and so forth need to be solved in the substitute marketplace aspect. And then finally, what we see are transformation. And here, in this quadrant, what's going on is we're reimagining applications. And my favorite is this world of sort of smart contracts, which I think is still far away, but there's many attempts here to run prototypes to figure out smart contracts. And the notion here is that, imagine if I have a will for myself, and currently the will is established, and then when some event happens, somebody expires, then I will, my lawyers will then do the work to make sure that all the transactions that I want in the will take place. Now, if you go to smart contracts, right? That goes away completely. We don't need an intermediary like a lawyer to do all the distributions. Once the event that triggers the will takes place, then all the other transactions that are subsequently built into the logic of the will also be triggered automatically as well. And you can imagine will is just one example. Deeds for property, contracts amongst organizations, even parking tickets can also be done this way. There's a question by a viewer, so we'll take that.
So related to what you're just talking about, Catherine is asking, will the blockchain lead to some types of jobs disappearing?
Oh, yeah. Will some types of jobs disappear? I think that's a great question. And I think this is a question that we're all facing now in the world of digital technologies. And it used to be that technologies would replace blue-collar workers. And now we're in a world of technologies potentially impacting white-collar workers as well as pink-collar workers. My sense is that the intermediary jobs will be at risk in the sense of just think through the amount of effort that organizations place on recording transactions, on validating transactions. Just think how big large accounting companies are, right, that go through our books to validate our books, right? Massive organizations, massive revenue for those organizations. And so there is worry that, in fact, those types of jobs might get automated away, might no longer be needed to that same scale. But the way to think about that is that then actually releases funds in the economy for other more high-value jobs in the marketplace. And so that becomes a key element for both workers that may be in these positions that are at risk, but also for companies and for governments to think through how the transitions will be handled once these technologies start to take over. You know, a related example is if you think about messaging, right? You think about SMS messaging versus messaging on Facebook or WhatsApp. The infrastructure required to support SMS messaging requires many more people than what WhatsApp had, you know, when it had 500 million or 1 billion people now on their platform. And so there is now a question about substitution. The digital native technologies require less labor than the existing older technologies, and we'll have to learn how to figure out what to do about these transitions going through. So this 2x2 helps us understand where we think technologies that use blockchain, and more importantly, the applications for those technologies will evolve. We're currently living in a world here of sort of single-use applications and localization. Lots of attempts are going on here, and you can start to think yourself, if you start thinking about your jobs, your functions, your organizations, where could a ledger that was shared across organizations would be useful? And then there's now early work